Welcome to When the Facts Change for this, my regular weekly show, released every Friday morning exclusively on my When the Facts Change Substack. Now, on Wednesday the 28th of January, the US Federal Reserve held its main policy interest rate at 3.5 to 3.75%. This follows 3 consecutive rate cuts in late 2025. Since August 2024, in fact, the US Central Reserve, the linchpin for monetary policy around the world, has lowered rates 6 times, all the way down from 5.5%. This latest decision to hold at 3.5 to 3.75 came despite huge pressure from President Donald Trump, who wants rates lower to stimulate the economy. The US government's even prosecuting Fed boss Jerome Powell regarding renovation cost overruns at the Federal Reserve building. What does the Fed's latest decision mean for global markets and the broader global economy, not least the UK, where the Bank of England faces another rate decision of its own on Thursday, February the 6th? I discuss all this and more with When the Facts Change regular Helen Thomas, CEO and co-founder of the markets consultancy Blonde Money. In other news, Keir Starmer's in China, the first visit of a British Prime Minister since 2018. The visit's controversial, given China's flouting of Western sanctions on Russia and its growing military aggression. I'm joined by former Tory leader IAIN DUNCAN SMITH, a noted China hawk, who rails against Starmer's decision to allow China's new super embassy in central London, and he also has advice for today's Tory leader, Kemi Badenoch. And we also continue our discussion on the UK's net zero policies here in the When the Facts Change studio, following Keir Starmer's admission in a new interview with the National Trust no less, that cross-party support for net zero has, quotes, broken down. I'm joined by David TURVER, a trained engineer and energy policy consultant, at a time when trade unions are urging Labour to ease green regulation in a bid to lower energy costs. David's written a report for the Institute of Economic Affairs on the eye-watering costs of net zero. We hold a detailed discussion. So another packed show here on When the Facts Change. Thanks so much to my paying subscribers for supporting me and independent media more generally. Lots to discuss, so let's get started. Helen Thomas, great to have you here on When the Facts Change as ever. Now, Blonde Money really specialises in financial markets consultancy, particularly the impact of politics and geopolitics on financial markets. I'm keen to get your response to this Fed decision. It was a hold at 3.5 to 3.75. How important is that? To what extent did it reflect the fact that US inflation at 2.8% is still quite toppy?
Yeah, well, the Fed is torn between this huge political pressure to cut rates and then the actual economic data. I mean, in the press conference, the chair, Jerome Powell, was saying, we continue to be surprised at how robust the economy is. And of course, as you tend to get with a growing economy, you get inflationary pressures. So, they're on hold. But interestingly, 2 dissents, both Stephen Miran and Christopher Waller wanting voting for a 25 basis point cut. No secret that they are Trump's people. And it says we're in a point where the politics and the economics are completely coming crashing into one another. I think, when it's sort of, to my mind, the Fed meeting kind of postponed the crunch point, which is, are they going to reach a point where the economy's running really hot and yet some of the members of the FOMC, maybe increasing members of the FOMC, will vote for cuts? I mean, it's quite remarkable.
Is Donald Trump dismantling the near 30 to 40 year consensus that there's been across the Western world for independent central banking, the operational independence of central banks to set interest rates? Are we seeing the US president take that to pieces in front of our eyes?
To a degree, although I think we talked before, Liam, that how independent really were central banks even in the past. I mean, obviously, George Osborne appointed Mark Carney. There was a Japanese Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, appointed Kuroda at the Bank of Japan. I mean, they were...
They're political chums, in other words.
Yeah, I mean, look, the head of the central bank is a political position. I think where maybe there's been a mistake is to have assumed it was a purely technocratic thing. I mean, Jerome Powell was actually, and still is, a good political player. So the two have all
appointed by Trump, of course, in Trump's first term, but then reappointed by Biden.
I know, absolutely amazing, isn't it? And actually, Trump has been saying quite clearly he would quite like Scott Bessent to be the Fed chair, his Treasury Secretary. That would be like here, the Chancellor Rachel Reeves getting moved to become Bank of England governor. It's. I think Trump's, as we always say with him, he says the quiet part out loud. Some other people have hidden behind the arguments for how to do it. He just bowls in there and goes for it. But there's no doubt that he wants to run the economy hot. Now, is that a real disaster for the independence of the central bank? I just think a lot of if you go back much further in history, there's been a lot of central bank Fed chiefs doing what the president wants. So I don't think it's as remarkable as it sounds, but it is a challenge to the consensus that we've had for the last 20 years. So you're right to say it's a real paradigm shift. Yes.
With Reform UK leading the polls in Britain, no one's quite sure at this point what they want to do in terms of independent central banking. Before we come on to the dollar, which of course has lost a lot of value. It's lost about 10% of its what we call effective exchange rate. As you know, you're a former currency dealer, Helen.
Yeah.
The effective exchange rate is a kind of basket of currencies, a kind of broad valuation of a currency. The dollar's lost a lot. But before we come back to that and why that's happening and what it means, how about the MPC's decision on February the 6th? What do you think will happen there? Of course, we've seen lots of rate cuts in the UK. We just saw inflation go up in the UK on the latest numbers. Do you think the MPC will hold as well next week?
I think they will hold. They barely got through the last cut. I mean, it's been really finely balanced. The last few decisions where they've moved interest rates have been on this 5-4 split decision. They're stuck in a similar situation, actually, which is that some of the labour market indicators look weak, but as you pointed out there, inflation remains buoyant. And broadly, we're kicking this off talking about central bank independence, what should central banks do? The real difference now is after about 25 years of worrying about deflation and disinflation, we are in a different world of let's say 2 to 4% inflation rather than 0 to 2. So it now that's could be a good thing if you can get the growth. That's the big difference, isn't it, between America and the UK? Actually, is why are they managing to get growth and we're not, despite the fact this government claims it's its central focus?
Because their energy prices are a third of ours. That's
there you go, Liam. Exactly, as you have covered, and I know you've had guests on this show who are very, very detailed focus on that. I mean, absolutely, that's a real bottleneck, isn't it, on the British economy? But yeah, I kind of think at the moment with the Bank of England that sometimes they quite like it if one of their meetings is just boring. I think they want boring for a while because there's so much going on geopolitically.
Boring February meeting in the offing for the central bank's monetary policy committee here in the UK. So let's go back to the dollar. It has lost quite a lot. Of course, Trump might quite like that because that makes America's exports more competitive, though, of course, a weaker dollar does provoke inflation because US imports are more expensive. It's quite a big move in the dollar, isn't it? Why is this happening, Helen? Is it because it's losing its safe haven status? We're certainly seeing very, very high gold prices and so on, maybe replacing the greenback as the safe haven of choice.
Well, the gold price rise is astonishing. I mean, as you say, I started out 25 years ago in currencies, and gold is always interesting. Is it a currency? And it's always been on the radar of currency traders. And it correlates to some other assets like the Swiss franc, and the Swiss franc is now extremely high levels against the US dollar because of this depreciation. I think there's a couple of things going on. I mean, currencies do tend to overshoot, so you can get really big trends, and it can be quite breathtaking how much they move. But it will have a pullback clearly at some stage. But I think what's going on in the dollar at the moment is a couple of things. One is hedging behavior, where this sort of started to happen last year, and you have phases of this where global investors hold a lot of assets in the US, sometimes very passively because they just own global equities, for example, or global bonds, where the US is a huge proportion of that investment. They might, be increasing their currency hedges due to geopolitical volatility, weaponization of financial markets. So I think it is kind of result of a reappraisal of what Donald Trump's trying to do with US, where the US market operates. And as you say, it does give a bit of a boost to him actually on the, a weaker dollar really net probably does help the Trump agenda. But I wouldn't call it a full scale, panic out of US assets because people don't trust them anymore. We're a very, very long way from that.
We read a lot about the Japanese bond market. It's not something that usually troubles most more casual observers of international financial markets. I know you and I have been talking about yen carry trades and Far Eastern markets for more years than we care to admit. What's actually going on here? Of course, we've got Japanese elections in the offing. We've got a prime minister who's trying to stimulate the economy in a very kind of un-Japanese way. Could the Japanese just describe briefly what's been happening, Helen? And could this be some kind of canary in the coal mine as the most indebted major economy in the world starts suffering from higher borrowing costs?
Well, I touched on a paradigm shift in a world where you go from 0 to 2% inflation to 2 to 4. Nowhere is that more of a dramatic change than Japan. As you mentioned, Liam, 20, 30 years, it was a lost decade, and now it's the lost decades, where Japan had the exact opposite problem on inflation, had deflation and a lot of debt, but a sort of aging, healthy per capita economy, and it's sort of just all the Japanese owned all the Japanese debt, and it was all kind of okay. I remember back in my early trading days, everyone said, shorting Japanese government bonds, as in expecting that bond price to fall, was the widow maker. It would never happen. The Bank of Japan
expecting the price to fall. In other words, the yield goes up. In other words, borrowing costs go up.
As we've all come to see, in these last 3-4 years, when you do have a lot of debt and you want to issue more debt, and the market takes fright that how are you going to finance it? It's never played out in Japan. But now in this new world, this paradigm shift we're talking about, it's a very different ball game because they have got inflation. The inflation rate is above the Bank of Japan's target for first time in many decades. The Bank of Japan itself, having been a huge buyer of Japanese government bonds, is stepping back, like many other central banks, from that market. And then you've got this government. So first female Prime Minister, Sanai Takeichi, has called a snap election.
Good pronunciation. You've been working on that.
I just have to say it a lot, amazingly. I did actually made my debut on Japanese TV at the start of the year. Quite amazing, actually. I digress, but there's a wonderful YouTube video of me dubbed into Japanese for their local broadcaster, which the only word I recognised was when it said blonde money. But anyway.
That's the important one.
That's the important one. But as I said to them, in the kind of, there's a global ugly contest in bonds, which Liam, you've been talking about for years. I mean, this huge pile of debt that's been ramped up, and Japan had kind of got away with it. I mean, they've got 260% debt to GDP.
People say, but they owe the money to themselves. It's Japanese citizens, it's Japanese banks that are heavily government controlled. Is that now unraveling?
Somewhat. I mean, you talk about a canary in the coal mine. I mean, I think it's the flip of this that is relevant, whereby Japanese domestic investors, those banks, those life insurers, pension funds, and there's as we know, an aging demographic in Japan. They were owning foreign bonds where they were picking up great yields because back in the day, there was no yield in Japan. So the issue there is, well, what if they do decide to hold more domestically? And I've seen some Japanese institutions are coming out saying we will increase our holding of our own bonds. Now, if they've been invested in gilts, US Treasuries, French bonds, that is a potential big flow shift, which could create once again a concern about how other countries will finance themselves.
So-called contagion, unnerving other, we should say, fragile sovereign bond markets.
And this is where the currency comes into play. The dollar against the Japanese yen is up at multi-decade highs. There has been talk about some kind of intervention. The Japanese have tended to be very, very sensitive to the price of the yen. And it's been starting to move a bit more significantly over the last week or so. Is there a kind of coordinated plan with the US? Whereby dollar goes down and the Japanese yen goes up, and this money does move, as we've been talking. Repatriation flows out of US into Japan. I mean, these are the sort of thing currency traders absolutely love. It can be a bit discombobulating for the rest of the world. One thing I say about currencies is they are a pressure valve. If they're moving a lot, that means there are stresses that are being let out through the currency market, and I think that's the real focus for now.
Final question, Helen. It's a question I've been mulling for quite a few weeks now here on the show. Look at the S&P 500 cyclically adjusted price-earnings ratio, the so-called Shiller Index, one of the most respected measures of stock market valuation. When it's high, that means stocks are very expensive compared to the earnings that the companies underlying are actually gaining, the business they're actually doing. The S&P 500 Cape Shiller's now above 40. It was 28 at the time of the 2008 financial crisis when we had a collapse. So it was seen as very overvalued at 28. It's now 40. The S&P 500, over half of the whole value of it is now AI stocks. There's a lot of hype here. Is this a bubble?
I'm going to say no. I know may well disagree on this, and that's good. But I say it now. Two things. One, this is a real technology that is being adopted. It is.
Sure.
It is. These are real earnings. Comparing that, like the Cape ratio, the Shiller ratio is very well respected. Absolutely. We are, the advocates for AI will say, well, we are in a technological revolution.
The fifth industrial revolution, as big as the internet, right?
Bigger potentially, and therefore.
But when the importance of the internet didn't stop the .com collapse, did it?
No, but those companies weren't making any actual money. These we're just getting US earnings through. Actually, it's a really important time in the markets every quarter. The big US earnings season. We just had Meta, Microsoft, Tesla. We've had Samsung, IBM, even Big Blue reporting. And what's quite interesting. So here's the part of this story that I think. So I'm talking about on a long-term level. I do believe in we are in a clear technological revolution, transformative power of AI. But what we're seeing with these earnings is they're knockout earnings. They are actually making money out of AI, but they are all suggesting there is potential stumbling block for supply. And you might have loads of demand, but if you haven't got the electricity to power it, as you come back to your point, you can't get the chips because they're made an astonishing
in Taiwan.
Yeah, and they're made by an astonishingly narrow group of people.
Who knows what's going to happen there?
And there's this huge Dutch company who make the machine that does these things to the chips. It's an incredible world, semiconductors. But there's a blockage. There is a blockage. So I think we will get to that crunch this year of, okay, those are the valuations, but how much of a crunch in supply is there? Does that derail the whole thing? Does it mean alternatives are there? Does it take the froth out of it? Because there's no doubt froth in the rally of these stocks. Even with the best fundamentals, you get exuberance.
Froth exuberance, supply concerns. Helen, great to talk to you as ever. We will discuss these issues again here on When the Facts Change. Great to see you.
Thanks, Liam.
Ian Duncan Smith, great to have you here on When the Facts Change. Clearly, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is in Beijing, the first state visit for many years by a serving British Prime Minister since Theresa May, actually. Should he be in China?
I don't think at this time he should be. And there's a reason for this. This idea that they're going to refresh relationships with China is ultimately a one-way process right now. He has got very little that China really wants other than essential diplomatic abilities with America, etc. And they're China themselves are unreformed, unrepentant, and are a threat to the West. And they are the single greatest threat we've faced, I would argue, since the Second World War. Some might argue since the end of the Cold War. But I think they're, in many ways, a greater threat than Russia ever was. And that's because we have fed their economy, and their economy now is huge. And I was making a point in the speech yesterday that I made about China, which was to do with Chagos. But I pointed out that people have got their heads in the sand, and Starmer's one of them. China is building a navy now, which within 2 years will overtake the US and Europe. Europe is a joke on navies, and Britain, you have to argue, is the only one that has anything, and that's not much. And the reality, therefore, is the threat they make now, within that space of time, will become very, very serious. And statistics on this are absolutely staggering. He is single-mindedly doing this. Any one shipyard, naval shipyard in China, now builds more naval ships than the whole of the United States and or Europe. One shipyard. He has 130 times the capacity to build naval ships that we in Europe and America have. That should frighten people, but it's not even talked about by the government, and they're still struggling to move their defense spending. So the reality is he's going there weekly. A poor economy, not much going for it at the moment, stupid decisions made by them, and his desperation is written across his face. Please give me growth. Of course, so President Xi must be smiling his head off. He's kowtowed to them over the mega embassy, which was his invitation card was, give us the embassy, you can come. I mean, who's making the terms for this meeting? And then he's just given this interview, I think about an hour ago, in which he says they had very amicable relations and they chatted about this and that and the other thing. Oh, yes, and he raised Jimmy Lai. And you can see what's going on. He raised Jimmy Lai. Was
a Hong Kong dissident who's been in prison for 5 years or so.
Yeah, Jimmy Lai is a British citizen. He stayed behind in Hong Kong when they put illegally, in breaching an international treaty, they put the national security law in, and they arrested many young democracy campaigners, many of whom have been tortured, put into prison, never appearing before a court. Jimmy Lai was the icon for them, and they found trumped-up charges. They've taken him in, embezzlement, all the other nonsense. They've seized his equipment illegal under common law, which no longer exists in Hong Kong. All of this goes on, and they kind of mention it in passing, really. That's what they did. And they were probably told by President Xi, yes, I understand, let's move on. And that's all they get. So they've got nothing in their back pocket. And all this stuff of 60 businessmen going over there. So many businessmen have left China now because it is a nightmare place to do business. They steal your IP. I was talking to a pharmaceuticals guy the other day who runs his own company, set it up, very successful man, set up a factory in China, was told this is the right thing to do. Within 6 months, he was informed that drugs were on the streets, which were effectively generic drugs, but were his. And they were being produced in another factory somewhere else. This happens all the time. He's had to pack up and move. Never wants to go back there ever again for the very simple reason. So you learn the hard way in China or you get taken over. You can even look at Musk now. Musk is now falling second to the Chinese electric car company. His factory, by the way, in China is owned by the state. He doesn't own it. So they can kick him out anytime they like, which they will do in due course when he's no longer of any use to them. So this is China. It does its own thing. It doesn't give a damn. It supports Russia in the invasion of Ukraine. Without China, Russia would never have invaded Ukraine. They am sure they have all the military equipment. They have the technology now, the dual-use technology, and the money. They buy the oil. and they give them finance. They've got them on their own banking system. So, you go around all this stuff. China's built this axis of totalitarian states. Iran, Russia, North Korea, and China are literally in lockstep as far as they possibly can be, and it's all spinning around the hub of Beijing. So this is just the beginning, and we are sleepwalking into this nonsense when Starmer goes off to make a trip like this. It shows that, Xi understands human nature, and as a sanctioned man, he knows that people like me pose him a threat, so he got to stop us having influence. And with Starmer, he's just smacking his lips. They're handing over the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, which is very close now to China. The Chagos Islands are more important probably than they've ever been in the past. They sit on the east-west trade routes. What does Russia want? What does China want to do? It wants to have control over the trade routes. That's why they seized the South China Seas. It's got nothing to just territorial. It's got everything to do with mineral rights, but more importantly, they want to dominate that east-west trade route. And that makes them all powerful once they do that. Such a threat to the West, such a threat to the free world, and we're sleepwalking into it, and Starmer is the biggest sleepwalker of the lot.
You're a Privy Councillor, former Conservative leader, of course. I'm sure you see all kinds of security intelligence that isn't publicly available. Tell us about your fears about the embassy in central London, the new Chinese embassy. Surely major powers need embassies in the centre of London. What are your specific objections to that site the British government has just cleared for China to build this new super embassy?
Well, it's the wrong site for the wrong government in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's as simple as that. Why? Number one, it's huge. It will be the largest embassy in the whole of Europe. When America needed to build a bigger embassy, they went to a location that therefore wouldn't interrupt communications, any links, any roads. It was not a part of London that was critical to every other part of London. It sits athwart the main routes east-west to Canary Wharf and the city. It's opposite the Tower of London. There's a huge amount of tourism in the area. It's very unnecessary to have that there. The other bits are that there is cabling, which we've known about for ages. But there's cabling in the area along the side and round up the roads between Canary Wharf and the city, and also into central London as well. And we believe, although this will never be confirmed or denied, that in amongst that is also security cabling or certain access for security cabling. And the government has spent the whole period denying, first of all, they denied its existence in where we said it was. Then they said it wasn't posing a threat. Then they got MI5 to put out a statement to say that the threat can be dealt with and coped with, etc., early on. And they've run on this lie forever. What do we find now? The moment they gave the embassy over, the GCHQ and MI5 made their position very clear. Literally, why they didn't do it before is beyond me. But they said they would not be able to deal with all of the threats that emanate from the embassy. So that's their real position. Okay, it came out after the decision was made. And then on top of that, almost within 24 hours of the decision, the government has now accepted that they're going to have to move the cabling, which they said didn't exist in quite the same way as we said. They're going to have to move it, which is causing real issues in the city because, of course, there could be the fear that something will go wrong when it's moved. We already know now that China has direct access to that cabling through a special setup that was made to get other things through, cables and through into the embassy grounds. Because originally, after it ceased being the Mint, it ended up as a bank. One of the banks held it. I can't remember. I think it might have been HSBC, but I can't remember. So it was used for banking purposes, linked obviously clearly to the city. All of that was so obvious to us all. Governments denied it. And it's because China has said they want this site, they want the embassy, and they want it now. And he wasn't allowed to go visit until he had granted it. And the other bit about it is fascinating, is it's been turned down once already, and it was turned down again by Tower Hamlets, and then they called it in. And
Local authority.
the whole thing stinks, really, frankly, of corruption. So China has been bullying the British embassy in Beijing, not allowed to have any repairs, cut the water off, cut the electricity off, and they've said, you ain't coming, and you're not getting any repairmen or any rebuilding of the embassy in Beijing until we've got our embassy over there. Now, that was barely ever reported in the papers, but, that's not a diplomatic act, that's a threat. But China doesn't give a damn. Would we do that to one of the embassies here? No, but they do. They don't care. So he goes over on bended knee, and they must be laughing their heads off at Keir Starmer. He's come with nothing. If you look at the financial services, by and large, they will continue to trade because it's not an area that is hit by tariffs or sanctions. It will trade on probably through Hong Kong, and that's the only thing that we, as it were, export that gives us any balance at all. The rest is a one-way street of Chinese slave-made, overproduced, subsidized product that will be dumped on our markets.
Tell us about your thoughts on China, Taiwan. 2027 is when President Xi has told his military bosses to be ready to take Taiwan. As you know, that's our best intelligence. We've seen far, far more incursions into Taiwanese airspace by Chinese military. We saw over the new year when the world was focused on Venezuela and Trump and Greenland, we saw the biggest ever war games off the coast of Taiwan, very close to the coast by China, basically on the scenario of blocking energy terminals, squeezing Taiwan. Is this a genuine possibility, Ian Duncan Smith, that China could try and take Taiwan as part of Xi's one China policy, so-called, that he talks about so much? And if that does happen, what can and should the West do?
Well, as I said, I've said time and time again, the difference between President Xi in China and other Western leaders is he doesn't change. He's the same guy that will be running it in 2027, has been running it, 5, 6, 10, 15 years ago. So his policy, his position doesn't change. He may modify it slightly, he may slow it up, he may speed it up. But in essence, he set out to overtake the US military sometime by 2030, I think was his target. He was slightly buffeted by COVID, but they've redoubled their efforts. As I've talked about endlessly, the Navy will overtake the US Navy in ship numbers and potency probably within the next 2 years. That's what people in the sea
On
are.
some measures, the Chinese Navy is already bigger. The US has got more aircraft carriers.
Yeah,
Chinese, for quite a few years, have had more ships overall. And of course, as you say, Ian, they've got much more replacement power because they've got so many more shipyards and are producing over half the world's steel.
Yeah, the whole point, you're exactly right. The main thing is the aircraft carriers, giving them reach. And what they want to do is to block off the US Pacific Fleet. If in any time they want to do anything with Taiwan, they need to stop it getting in the way. The only way you do that is through strength. And that is why their timings for this are based on their all-round capability to do it. They couldn't do it now because in terms of capability and weaponry, America is still in a better state than China is. But the reality is that they're making every effort to overtake it, and they will do this. So your answer to your question, could they invade it? The answer is they could certainly have a go at it. But I don't think invasion is their plan. They don't really need to invade Taiwan. All they need to do is blockade it. And that means keep the Americans at bay and just stop anything going to and from, all aircraft, all shipping. It's an island. It requires food and other things to be shipped to it.
Massive dependency in Taiwan on imported liquefied natural gas, as you know.
Yeah, very much so. So the reality is it would happen quite quickly. I was arguing with a colleague here, so, what do we care about it? Taiwan's just an island, give it to them, that should be theirs anyway. And I said, well, there's no history of it ever being officially part of China. But anyway, I didn't get into the argument. I said, the thing why you should be interested is that if China takes Taiwan, the hit to the Western economy will be staggering. Many times more. I mean, there's some talk around about 10 trillion. A hit to the global economy because of the dependency on them for their advanced chip manufacturers, etc. But the main thing is that would lead to kind of economic winter in the West if that
Do we go
happens.
to war with China? What happens? What do we
Well,
do?
here's the problem. We've done absolutely nothing to prepare for this in Europe. Europe is a joke. We can say what we like about Starmer, not about Starmer, about Trump. But Trump at least has made people understand in Europe that they can't really talk at the same level as he does for one very good reason. They have no military capability worth a damn. We are probably the more powerful in military terms in a way, certainly if you include the Navy, but we are a joke compared to what we were 15, 20 years ago, where our Navy is very small and we invest very little money in short-term replacement. So the reality is that the US still remains the only nation at the stage that has any chance whatsoever of making President Xi blink. The one thing that they have in their favor beyond military capability is that China has not fought a war in a long, long time, almost pretty much since their attempted invasion of Vietnam, where they got their backsides handed to them by the Vietnamese. Now, that's what bothers Xi, I understand, is that he's not sure how the PLA and how his military forces would be able to work without that experience that comes in the West from things like Afghanistan and knowledge now that's come back from Ukraine, etc. So all of that, I think, is the one sort of a hesitant feature of what he does, because if he doesn't manage to blockade Taiwan, then it all folds back up for him in China. So that is the only thing that holds back anything happening. But in the next 2.5 years, 2 years, you may be right, even less than that, the option is there. It's not there at the moment, but it does become available to him in that timescale. And we are doing nothing to deal with it. Britain should be involved in the Far East. It is as much our problem as it is the Americans. Europe should recognize that as well, but Europe is, in a mess over Ukraine. So the UK is the only country, I think, that is able to project anything at all into the Pacific, and they should do so. And it's not enough, but we're going to have to get our skates on because we're going to have to increase it. In those next 2 years, we have got to start recognizing that we've got to build to meet the threat, and we're not doing it.
Finally, Ian, I can't have you on the show without asking you, as a former Tory leader, your thoughts on what's been going on in the Conservative Party. Of course, we've seen some high-profile defections to Reform UK. We've seen Suella Braverman, former Home Secretary, Rob Jenrick, former Minister, of course, Danny Kruger, Drew Rossendale, whose constituency is very close to yours, someone very much, if I may say so, from your part, formerly from your part of the Conservative Party. Should the Conservatives be worried about these defections? Because some of your colleagues have been trying to convey that this is a good idea to get rid of the rubbish, it's been said.
Well, people say lots of things in the course of events like this. The question that you ask me, should we worry? Yes, we should worry about this because we need to have a functioning, strong Conservative Party if in any way we're to take on what essentially has become a dominating left. So, there are now 4, maybe 5 parties. It's difficult to know with Jeddah whether or not he's a party or not. But yeah, 4 or 5 parties on the left. We have now 2 parties on the right. The reason why the government is in power today is wholly down to the fact that the right has split. There's no other reason. They only got 33.8% of the vote, which, when I was leader, was where we were in opposition.
That's right.
The idea that you get a government with the biggest majority ever on 33.8% of the vote has only one reason, and it's nothing to do with popularity for Keir Starmer. It's down to the fact that the right is split, that the Reforms set candidates up in lots of seats. They split the vote, and all over the Southwest, for example, it's just not just in the Red Wall. In the Southwest, the Liberals gained seats because we had 2 right-of-centre parties competing for the seat, and of course you saw what happened. Were we to blame? Yes, of course we were. We lost the plot, really, in the period from Brexit. We got Brexit done, and my argument would be we should have then doubled down and maximised on the benefits that we could do, such as regulation change, a whole new concept of how we govern, reminding ourselves that we possess the greatest legal system in the world called English common law, the most flexible, the one that every country chooses if they want to set up a business or a financial centre. They don't pluck European law to run it. They blew English common law, America's English common law, the Commonwealth English common law. We should have maximised our change to regulations using English common law, got rid of all the European law stuff. We should have been very bold about maximising our ability to export, to be able to produce goods, say to the really productive farms, you shouldn't be using subsidies, but what we will help you with is exports at all, and the rest, all of that, we could have got costs of running the country down. I wrote a paper for Boris Johnson called the Tigger Report, Task Force on Innovation, Growth and Regulatory Reform. It's 100 recommendations. And one of the big things that really irks me is that we said that one of the big things as a takeaway from COVID was the existence of medtech. Now, the UK should be the capital of the world for medtech. And I said, the reason is we have a resource called the health service sitting on our doorstep. Nobody else has this peculiar scale of data about disease that the UK does. To be able to access that here in the UK, companies will come from all over the world to set up in the UK. It would be bigger than financial services. It needs regulatory change, I said, and then you leave it to the rest. The businesses will do this. The farmers will come in, pharmaceuticals. They will do this, and it will have a huge impact on the UK's economy. As I said, bigger than financial services was my projection. And we did next to nothing. They sat on their hands. So in all of this and our problems over migration, which we sort of recognized as a major deal, we should have made steps. We should have taken on the vested interest and said, right, we're going to leave the Convention of Human Rights unless they give maximum change to the way they deal with refugees. The rest of Europe's pissed off with it too, excuse my language. But we could have done all of that. And our problem is we didn't do the right thing. We weren't bold. We didn't maximize this massive change that we had brought upon ourselves. And the public got angry with us. And they're angry now, which is why they've gone to reform. And many of my colleagues think that it's the only way to get things done. I don't agree with them. And we'll see how it pans out over the next 2 years. So your answer to your question is, yes, I am worried. But in Kemi, I really do think we've got somebody. When I voted for her not because of any policy statements. I voted for her because I was looking at the strength of her character. And I said, what is it about her that I think is able to take us out of this? And we're seeing now that strength of character coming through in decisions. She's made the decision about the convention. She's made the decision about ridiculous things to do with taxation. And she said to her party, you either back me or go away somewhere else. Now, that really reminds me a lot of Mrs. T. I know I'm not trying to say she's a new Mrs. Thatcher, but the thing about Mrs. T wasn't her massive reach of detail, because she was very good at that. It was her courage when she faced a big decision. She would take the decision that she believed to be right. She didn't get persuaded by people who said, oh, it's to the left or it's to the right. She took the decision that she felt would benefit the British people best. And I honestly see that in Kemi. And I know Nigel Farage. I've known him for years. I get on with him, very well. I don't see that with him. In governing terms, I don't. Not to say I'm being rude about him. I just don't see it quite in the same way as I see it with her. So we've discovered somebody, I think, who has guts, courage, and will take on vested interests, as she did with the trans issue, which is a disaster. We meandered around that. But she was bold and took on these people. I've seen her argue. I have to tell you, she's good. And that was the reason why I think we have a chance to get our house back in order. So I say to my colleagues, you need to give her a bit of time. And I think she will come good. They would have got rid of Thatcher early on because she sounded strange and was a woman and didn't seem to know what she was doing. And then she bestrode the world like a colossus. People develop. If they have the right attributes, they develop. And I have that with Kemi.
IAIN Duncan Smith, thanks so much for appearing on When the Facts Change.
Now, the UK political consensus in favour of policies to promote net zero by 2050 is broken. They're the words of Prime Minister Keir Starmer in a recent interview with the National Trust, no less. Why has that consensus broken down? In part, it's because trade unions are concerned about the impact of net zero policies on UK jobs up and down the country, but also it's high energy costs, with firms and households screaming about bills that are 3 times higher than many other G7 countries. To discuss all this, the cost of net zero, I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by David TURVER. David, great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
On When the Facts Change. You are an engineer, you're an energy consultant. In recent months and years, you've really written a lot about the cost of net zero, the way UK energy policy is going. You have your own Substack, which please do mention, which I follow and recommend that When the Facts Change readers also follow it. Just give us the thrust of your IEA report.
Well, what I went through there is all the different estimates that the various bodies have put together to estimate the cost of net zero, starting with Phil Hammond back in 2019 when he was trying to derail it. And he came up with a number of about $1 trillion. And then we've had the Climate Change Committee, the National Energy System Operator, NESO.
So these are government bodies.
Government bodies or quasi-government bodies. And they've had numbers that have gone all over the place. The latest report from NESO was in December of last year. And basically I went through all of, they produced what they call an economic annex, and then there's a lot of very detailed spreadsheets. So I went through the detailed spreadsheet and basically add up all the numbers. And for their preferred scenario that they call holistic transition, if you add up the capital and the operating costs, you get to a number of 7.6 trillion. And then they add another 1.4 trillion for carbon costs, giving a grand total of about 9 trillion.
That's 9 trillion between now and 2050.
Yeah.
And just to put that in context, so UK annual GDP is something like 2.7, 2.8 trillion. So it's 3 times plus annual GDP over a period of 25 odd years. A huge amount of money.
Yes, a huge amount of money. But it is worth noting that that's the gross cost of building and operating the energy system between now and 2050. It isn't quite the net cost of net zero, because if we continued as we are, we'd have to spend some money as well. And of course, the cost of net zero will be the difference between them. But the thrust of my report was no one is producing what you might call a null scenario. No one's saying, what would the energy system cost if we wound back all the carbon taxes, if we wound back all the subsidies for renewables, if we started fracking or we restarted drilling in the North Sea, or heaven forbid, we sorted out the regulation and we could build nuclear as cheaply as they can in Korea. So everything is sort of like tilted towards doing net zero, and we can't have a proper public debate unless we know the cost of a proper alternative.
Now, you are very much a technical guy, as I said, but I also know from your writing and talking to you that you have a very astute political antenna too, if I may say so. Where do you think, Starmer's right, isn't he? Interesting he gave that interview to the National Trust and not a sort of national newspaper. Maybe he's hoping people won't notice what he said to the National Trust. We can do what we can to make sure that they do. Where do you think this breakdown in the consensus is coming from? Is it high energy prices? Just take us through how high energy prices are in the UK for firms and households. Is it from the trade unions who have been increasingly vociferous against net zero, not least the GMB, the third biggest union in Britain? Where do you think this shift in the Overton window, if you like, on net zero is coming from, and has it surprised you, that shift?
Well, I think it started probably in 2024 when Reform stood on a ticket of abolishing net zero, but they were then at least sort of like a fringe party. I think the real sea change came when Kemi Badenoch said about this time last year that the Tories would no longer stand by it.
Yeah, she said net zero 2050 is impossible. It's a huge move for the leader of the opposition.
And then they sort of doubled down at that at the Tory party conference where they said they would abolish net zero, they would repeal the Climate Change Act. And they went even further than some of the Reform noises by saying that they would get rid of renewable obligation subsidies sort of almost immediately, and they would roll back carbon taxes off electricity prices, which would be, in my view, would at least be a hugely positive move.
Which would bring electricity prices down, right?
Yes, yeah. So something like, I did some numbers for this earlier this month, something like 37% of the wholesale price of electricity, which everyone says is driven by gas, is actually carbon costs. And carbon costs of
taxation.
Yeah. So there's something called the Carbon Price Support Scheme and the Emissions Trading Scheme. And the Emissions Trading Scheme part of that has essentially doubled over the past year since Starmer announced that he was going to align to the EU.
That's the Ed Miliband Fighting Fund, effectively.
Yes,
right?
Indeed. So I think that's on the broad political scale, but I think it's taken them too long. But the unions are also waking up to, well, actually, if we have high energy costs, we don't have energy intensive industry.
That's right.
Which means we lose a lot of jobs, and not only that, we lose a lot of productivity and gross value added.
We're seeing blast furnaces shut down in Port Talbot. We're seeing Grangemouth one of our major refineries and sort of, energy complexes closed down. We're seeing all kinds of industrial firms being squeezed, not just by labour costs, of course, national insurance contributions and so on, but mainly by the energy price.
Yes, and not only does it affect the oil refineries, it affects the downstream as well. So petrochemicals, plastics and chemicals downstream of those all are very highly energy intensive and highly capital intensive. But if energy is too expensive, then they'll just go abroad. So Jim Ratcliffe announced last year he was
runs INEOS that owns Grangemouth.
He was sending a couple of billion of investment that would have gone here to America, where their gas is 3 times cheaper than ours, at least.
To what extent is the UK an outlier in terms of our political establishment's continued clinging to net zero targets? For instance, our petrol and ban on new petrol and diesel cars is 2030, because Labour brought it forward to 2030, and the EU's is shifting from 2035 probably to 2040. How long can we as Britain continue to be, if we are indeed an outlier?
Well, I think Britain and Europe are sort of an outlier in the world.
Yeah.
So if you go onto our world in data and look at consumptions of hydrocarbons, coal, oil, and gas, then the latest data for which is available is 2024, and that was a record year for coal, oil, and gas, and of course the total was a record as well. So that means that essentially, although we're reducing our consumption, the rest of the world is not paying attention at all. It's focusing on cheap energy. So, I've thought for some time that our position is untenable, but of course I'm not energy minister. And the fact of the matter is we've got a zealot in that seat in government, and it's difficult to tell what will be the trigger for him to change course, because allegedly Starmer tried to get rid of him in his reshuffle and didn't have the power to do so. So
because he's popular among Labour activists, if not the unions, but he's popular among activists who want him to be the next Labour leader, right?
Yeah. So I think the position is untenable. The unions are increasingly thinking that too. So I suspect there'll be some sort of fracture in the Labour Party at some point, but it's difficult to say when. But I think that will be almost like a Berlin Wall moment. And it feels as though the pressure is building, and there will be some sort of blow off soon, but you can never tell when.
In terms of the pressure, we've talked about trade unions. Gary Smith at GMB in particular, very articulate critic of the government's net zero policy from a trade union perspective. Tell us about our energy costs, David. To what extent is the UK an outlier on energy costs? I mentioned that it's almost a political truism. For some time, wholesale costs here have been 3 times what they are in the States. In many other G7 countries, not least in continental Europe, they're much cheaper too. So to what extent are we an outlier there, and what kind of damage do you see that doing to the economy?
Well, interestingly, the government produces 2 sets of figures on electricity and gas costs. One for what you might call the developed world from the International Energy Agency, and the other for the UK and the EU. On both of those measures, we have the highest industrial electricity costs, what you might say in the developed world.
Yeah.
On domestic, it's better to compare to Europe. And depending on whether you look at small, medium or high users, we're either second or third highest behind Germany and I think Ireland from memory, or it might be Denmark. On gas, our gas prices are similar to those of Europe because it's a sort of almost a
single market.
Almost a single market. They tend to be just a couple of percentage points lower. But European gas prices are 3 or 4 times more expensive than those in America or Canada.
Yeah.
And that means, and so I guess we and Europe are outliers compared to the rest of the world. And that's the reason why we and Germany in particular are deindustrializing, because it's just too expensive to make stuff.
What's been the response of the establishment, if you like, the energy complex in government across Whitehall to your report? Because let's be clear, the IEA, it's the granddaddy of think tanks. To publish an IEA report is a pretty high profile thing to do. They're a very respected organisation. Has the Green Blob tried to knock you down, attacked you personally?
Not really a personal attack, but yes, I would describe them in the way they've reacted in the way you might imagine a vampire reacts to a sort of like sunlight. But my phrase is sunlight is the best disinfectant. So what they really objected to was me publishing the gross costs, like the 7.6 or 9 trillion as we discussed earlier.
But you were working off their numbers.
Exactly. And the table, so the IEA made a big thing about that in all their PR stuff. But if you go and look at the table, I compare that to what they call their falling behind scenario and put the difference in between them. So, I think it was, in essence, they're sort of like trying to protest too much. Because the main point of what I was saying is, look, net zero is proving very damaging. And whether you believe all the climate change stuff or not, my contention would be that the net zero policies are actually worse than climate change will ever be. And if we're going to have a proper debate about it, we need to know the cost of going to net zero. Oh, and by the way, I did go do some extensive analysis in there that shows that their numbers are probably an underestimate, a significant underestimate.
Wow.
And what we need is is two other scenarios. One is let's keep what we've got now and don't go any further. And the second one is just roll back everything. And I would certainly be in the roll back everything camp. And then compare those numbers. And I think that's possible to do. And I think the difference between those numbers would be several trillion. I won't go more precise than that because there's just too many variables and too much data to go through. But even that is a very significant sum. And even in their holistic transition, 1.4 trillion of carbon costs works out roughly 2% of GDP per year.
Yeah.
And that will be front loaded. In their falling behind, their carbon costs are roughly double that. And they're still spending hundreds of billions on wind farms and solar panels and EVs and heat pumps and stuff. It's just that they're going a bit more slowly, but the carbon costs have doubled. So that's getting on for 4% of GDP per year in carbon costs. The economy can't stand that.
Where is the pressure for all this stuff coming from? Tell us about the green vested interests. It seems a lot of people are making a lot of money out of net zero, while a lot of households and firms are losing a lot of money, and the growth of the economy is being severely curtailed.
Yes, I think the economy is being severely curtailed. A lot of it comes essentially from the various, I've forgotten how many there are now, 30 or 31 conference of the parties meetings where they all go off on a jamboree each year on private jets to complain about how we're all damaging the environment, but they're all fine. And what was called the Paris Agreement from 2015, where we sort of agreed to cut our emissions, which then goes back to UN Sustainable Development Goals and all sorts of stuff like that. So essentially, it's a supranational set of organisations that are pushing this, but
a lot of companies are getting a lot of subsidies, right?
Yes, and
without many questions asked, because the politicians want to be seen spending the money on this cause.
So the politicians are sort of like making a virtue out of it because they allegedly say they're saving the planet. That's a dubious claim anyway. But and then they sort of like greenwash themselves and get the nice sort of like warm glow of shaking hands with Greta Thunberg and so on. And then, of course, because what they're fundamentally, the energy system that they're putting in is not competitive with what we've got at the moment, so they have to subsidise it. And that costs roughly 12 billion a year in subsidies if you add up renewable obligations, contract for difference, and feed-in tariffs.
That's where we are, about 12 billion a year. Yeah. Wow.
And then there are additional on-costs on top of that. So wind farms and solar panels, they're intermittent, so you can't rely on the sun shining or the wind blowing. So
you have gas-fired power stations on standby, which is hugely expensive if they're only producing from time to time.
Indeed. So we've got something called a capacity market. That costs about $1.25 billion, forecast to go up to over $4 billion by the OBR. And then we've got these things
per year.
per year.
These are massive numbers.
Huge numbers. And then we've got what we call grid balancing costs. So we need to have things sort of in a state of readiness to, if the wind gusts or it drops or whatever.
Yeah.
That's called the balancing market. So in that we pay wind farms to turn off when there's too much wind, and we might pay a gas-fired power station to fire up because we can't get the wind to where it's needed and so on. That costs about 2.7 billion a year. NESO themselves forecast that rising to between 6 and 8 billion by 2030-31. And Ofgem is spending of the order of 80 billion to, well, they claim to upgrade the grid, but what they're really doing is expanding the grid, because these wind farms, offshore wind farms, they're dozens of miles out to shore, hundreds of miles away from the source of demand. So you need lots more wires to connect it all up. And of course, they're very dispersed as well. And that's costing billions, and that will add more fixed costs to the grid.
Just finally, David, tell us about demand for electricity here in the UK, seeing as that's where we are, but also globally. Obviously, AI, data centers, this is the great new hope for global growth, the great new productivity driver. We've heard some warnings, muted warnings, from the outgoing chair of the National Grid, John Pettigrew, and I congratulate him for those warnings. Incredible how little they've actually been publicised, his speeches. But as an energy consultant, as an expert in this field, tell us about the future demand for electricity. Will the UK be able to meet it? And again, what could be the economic implications of that?
Well, our domestic generation is actually falling. So despite us probably roughly doubling generation capacity, the amount we're generating from it is falling, because essentially we're replacing cheap, reliable power stations with unreliable wind and solar. And our prices have gone up. If you contrast us to the US, they are currently going hell for leather to build as much generation capacity as they possibly can. They're restarting old nuclear power stations that were previously mothballed. They're restarting the construction of things that were under construction before and stopped. And they're starting, I don't think they've dug ground yet, but they're starting the permitting to build another 10 big ones, and they've got a whole thing on small modular reactors. That's because of the AI boom. So just before the US election in 2024, Sam Altman of ChatGPT floated the idea of building 7 5-gigawatt data centers. Now, 5 gigawatts, to put that in context, is like 1.5 Hinkley Point Cs. So even if you get Hinkley Point C online, it in itself wouldn't be big enough to run one of these data centers that he's talking about.
Wow!
So
and this is the biggest construction project in Europe at this point, down in the west of the West Country of the UK.
So unless we change course, we haven't got a hope in hell of competing here. Not just on generation capacity, but of course, if our energy is expensive, why would you put a data center here? You might as well put it in the US and just have fiber optic cables.
That's right.
The other big knock-on effect of that is nuclear's relatively long lead time. So they're building gas-fired generators to power these data centers now, which means that the lead time for new gas turbines is probably about 8 years. So our fleet is aging, and even Ed Miliband agrees we're going to need
more gas-fired power stations.
More gas-fired power stations.
Because you need those to make the renewables work, because they're to breach the intermittency problem.
Exactly. But we haven't got any on order.
And global supply chains are absolutely rammed because the Americans are building loads of gas-fired, all the very specialised components. Crikey, that is scary. Final question, David. It strikes me, maybe I'm being politically cynical, or maybe I've just seen a lot of this stuff before. I don't think you're going to get a proper needle-moving moment when it comes to the politics of net zero until there's some kind of, and I hate to say there's some kind of power cut, some kind of outage, which Miliband and his acolytes will deny it, but it's clearly linked to intermittency or something else. Without wishing to be scaremongering, I know you're a very, very responsible analyst and you're very, very measured in what you write and absolutely data-driven. Is that a possibility? Could we be facing the prospect of energy shortages leading to outages?
Yes. In fact, we came very close in January last year. My contact, Catherine Porter, wrote an extensive piece about that, and she got into big trouble with NESO.
Yeah. Who's indeed appeared on here on When the Facts Change.
And she knows more about that than I, but we came very close.
Yeah.
Of course, Spain had a big blackout in April last year because they had too much solar and so on. And as our gas-fired power stations dwindle and become less reliable because they're older and running beyond their design life, it becomes much more likely that there's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
I'm in the middle of writing a piece where I just look at what our, if we assume gas-fired power stations are extending their life to 35 years, what is our firm power capacity? And it starts dropping a lot in sort of like 2027, 2028. And I think, last year we got through by the skin of our teeth. We may get through this year by the skin of our teeth. But that's no way to run a G7 country, to get through winter by the skin of your teeth on the electricity system. I mean, that's Banana Republic territory. So, and it isn't going to get any better over the next 2 years. In fact, it's going to get worse.
Banana Republic territory. David TURVER, great to talk to you. Thanks for coming into the When the Facts Change studio. And thanks to all my viewers and listeners for joining me here on When the Facts Change. We got another packed show next week. Thanks for being with me. Thanks for joining When the Facts Change, economics and politics in a fast-moving world with me, Liam Halligan. Please subscribe to my When the Facts Change YouTube channel and my podcast via Spotify, the podcast app, or wherever you listen. And above all, please subscribe to my When the Facts Change Substack for more of my interviews and writing.